once the Stoicism got started, the Stoics entered in dialogue and cross-criticism with other schools, the Peripatetics, which were the followers of Aristotle, the academic Skeptics, which were so-called because they were based in Plato's academy, although Plato was long dead at that point, and they sort of turned towards skepticism, toward not maintaining any particular opinion too strongly, because you never know, because human knowledge is impossible according to the skeptics, and of course the Epicureans, right? So we have records of back and forth among these 3 or 4 schools, and that to some extent changed each one of these schools because they were having to respond to criticisms. So, for instance, my favorite example is that the academic skeptics and the Stoics started out with very different notions of epistemology, very different theories of truth, of knowledge. As I said, the skeptics said basically that there is no such thing as human knowledge, that because your senses can mislead you, your reasoning can go wrong without you noticing, so really there is no knowledge, and therefore you should hold no opinion. Right? The Stoics started out kind of the opposite extreme. It said, no, at least the sage, not most people, but the sage, the ideal Stoic, the best possible human reasoner, he will have knowledge of things because his reasoning abilities are perfect. And so even given correct information, he will in fact arrive at correct conclusions. Well, so this back and forth then eventually ended up with kind of a compromise because the skeptics pointed out that maybe the sage can get to that point, but since there is no sage out there to be seen, or at least the sage is an incredibly rare thing, so most of us can't use that kind of theory of knowledge, so it's not very useful. So what about the rest of us? And the Stoics counterpointed that, well, look, if you really believe that you should hold no opinions, then on what basis are you going to act? Because when you decide on action, a course of action in life, presumably you do it because you think that's the right course of action, or you're going to act randomly. That doesn't make sense. So the skeptics say, well, yeah, that's right. So some opinions are better than others. They're still not knowledge, but some opinions are in fact more likely than others. So in the end, they converged. The Stoics granting it, yeah, sure. At best, the sage has knowledge. The rest of us have to go on the basis of opinion. And the skeptics sort of granted that, yeah, not all opinions are created equal. So it is okay to hold on to some opinions, although you should do that lightly because it might still be the case that you're wrong. But you have to hold some opinions, otherwise you don't. You cannot act. So these discussions went on for centuries, literally, and they got modified. There were also discussions internal to Stoicism. Like Cleanthes, who was the second head of the Stoa after Zeno, had some opinions that were different from those of Zeno's, and more importantly, Chrysippus, who was the third head of the Stoa, definitely had opinions that were at odds on a number of subjects, especially logic, with those of Zeno. And yet he was so influential that Diogenes Laertius, in the Lives and Opinions of the Eminent Philosophers, tells us that if it were not for Chrysippus, there would be no Stoa. Meaning that Chrysippus' influence is so big, and that most of what we understand today as Stoicism comes from Chrysippus, that if he had not been there, you would have a completely different sort of philosophy, and it might not have survived, because in fact there is reason to believe that the Stoa was in decline under Cleanthes, because Cleanthes was a hard worker, but he was not a particularly charismatic leader or philosopher. So sort of attendance to his lectures went down. It was Chrysippus that kind of resurrected the whole thing, and that didn't stop. I mean, when the Stoa moved to outside of Athens, and Stoics started moving and teaching in different places, in Rhodes, in Alexandria, in Egypt, and especially in Rome. That was the period of the so-called Middle Stoa. The two major people in the Middle Stoa are Panicius and his student Posidonius, and we know that they also disagreed, not just with Zeno, but with Chrysippus. And then later on, once you have the so-called late Stoa, those are Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and all those others. Seneca explicitly says in the letters to Lucidas, these people that preceded us are not our masters; they're just our teachers. if I reasonably disagree with them, I am going to disagree. And it's not that just because Zeno or Chrysippus said something and that goes. It's not the Bible. It's not Scripture.
Yeah.
So we really need to realize that Stoicism started out with multiple influences. It almost immediately began to change, even in the first 2 or 3 generations of teachers, and it kept changing. Right. So this kind of Stoicism you see in Epictetus, for instance, is very similar in some respect to the original, to the early Stoicism of Zeno and Chrysippus, but there are also major differences. He talks about things like role ethics that did not exist and in the time of Chrysippus, were not articulated in the early Stoa, as far as we know. Epictetus sort of added this notion and made it central to his teachings of the 3 disciplines of desire, action, and assent. He organized his entire philosophy around those. And he talked very little about the 4 virtues, if at all. So that was a fairly major shift. And we're talking now 500 years after Zeno was practicing, 400 years after Zeno was practicing. Yeah. So that kept going, because even after the end of the sort of the third Stoa, the late Stoa, so after the end of the Roman Empire, when pretty much all of the Hellenistic philosophies went, they had no more influence. The schools were closed. Christianity became the dominant, sort of religious and philosophical force in the West. Even then, Stoicism kept influencing a number of people, including several Christian writers. And when it reemerged for the first time officially during the Renaissance under what is called Neo-Stoicism, which was put forth by a guy named Justus Lipsius, and that influenced people like Montaigne and Descartes and so on and so forth. Well, there were major differences. Lipsius was trying to actually reconcile Stoicism with Christianity. Now move forward another, 400 years close to, and now we are into modern Stoic movement, and we're having these discussions about which part of the original, should be retained. There's a big discussion about the Stoic notion of God and providence. Should that stay? Should that go? What happens if it goes? So really, people should understand it. And Stoicism, of course, is not an exception. It's the norm. All philosophies and, in fact, all religions evolve through time.